Who were the Seleucids? The largest and most diverse empire of the Hellenistic world, and yet so underappreciated and overlooked. What do we know about this empire, and why do we know so little? Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm speaking with Derek L., the host and creator of the Hellenistic Age Podcast, about this vast and vastly overlooked period of history. Now, if you find the rise and fall of empires fascinating, then we do have some very exciting news. We have officially launched tickets to Classical Wisdom Symposium 2021, The End of Empires and the Fall of Nations, taking place this August 21 and 22. We're thrilled to have an amazing lineup of some of the most brilliant minds to discuss history, philosophy, and mythology. Join Niall Ferguson, Edith Hall, Donald Roberson, Paul Cartledge, just to name a few. And make sure you can secure your tickets at classicalwisdom.com/symposium. Best of all, we want to make sure anyone and everyone can join us for this star-studded event. If you can't afford the ticket price, just email us at info@classicalwisdom.com and we'll help you out. Now, time to explore a fascinating, extensive, and multicultural corner of the ancient world, the Seleucidian Empire. Like Seleucids. So now, Seleucids, I think most people hear that word and they don't really know anything about it. And it's an empire. So why don't you maybe help us out by giving us a brief overview of this empire and what was its impact and what's its TLDR to begin with?
So we have to start with the time of Alexander the Great, and more specifically, the final days of his life. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered the Persian Empire in a 10-year campaign stretching from Greece to India, had died in 323 BC in June in Babylon. And the problem was that he had no immediate successor to the throne. And so the only people that were left behind were a brother who was either intellectually or disabled to some degree, and a son who was just a newborn, or he was still his mother Roxanne was still pregnant with him. Now, immediately the empire almost descended into a series of civil wars that lasted for 40 years, contested over by Alexander's generals, often known as the successors. The main ones of these that kind of came out on top were the Antigonid dynasty, who resided in Macedon, which is northern Greece, the Ptolemies, who controlled much of Egypt and parts of Libya and a little bit of southern Syria and Lebanon. And then lastly, the Seleucids, kind of our main focus here. Now, the Seleucus the first member of the dynasty, we'll call it, was a kind of a lesser known figure of Alexander's time. He was a subordinate general and kind of was a background character. He wasn't really too involved in the narrative. He pops up here and there, and eventually he is given control as the satrap or governor of Babylon, or in modern Mesopotamia, or in Mesopotamia. From there, Seleucus kind of gradually grew in power and prestige, and eventually he started taking part as a major player within the wars of Alexander's empire. Eventually, Seleucus, battles the Antigonid rivals, and then eventually comes to terms with them. He, at this point, controls much of Mesopotamia and parts of the Iranian plateau. And, from that point on, his dynasty, which lasts from the beginning of approximately 312 BC until around the 70s, 60s BC. I don't know my specific dates on that one, so you have to excuse me, but they control as far as the Balkans in modern Thrace, or in ancient Thrace, all the way to the shore or the edges of the Hindu Kush and in India, and parts of upper northern Tajikistan, Kazakhstan. That's the broad extent. And then to the southeast or southwest, would be Syria. Now, the Seleucid Empire generally is a huge entity. And they were the largest of the main successors to Alexander's empire. And if you're looking for kind of like a narrative that would be like somebody that maybe most people would know the Seleucids from, you would either know them from their conflicts with Rome through the wars of Antiochus III. Alternatively, the Wars of the Maccabees and the book of books 1 and 2 of Maccabees from the Bible. That's especially referring to the rebellion of Jerusalem and Judeans, or at least some faction of Judean subjects from King Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And that's kind of a subject we'll definitely talk about in a little bit. But the Seleucid Empire is just this large ethnic entity of, although it's ruled by Greeks mainly, Greco-Macedonian rulers, they controlled a huge diversity of populations ranging from Babylonians to Aramaic speakers of all varieties, Jews, Iranians, steppe peoples, as far as modern Afghanistan, like I mentioned. And it was a challenge to maintain it. Now, there's always been a discussion as to whether the Seleucids were, a kind of this like lumbering giant that broke easily at the touch, because there was you have kind of high points and low points where the greatest extent of the empire was under Seleucus I. You have a couple, decades of relative peace, but then interdynastic strife and civil war and wars with other rivals kind of sapped the empire's ability to maintain itself. And so parts broke off, where you have the rivals of steppe nomads like the Parthians into Iranian territory. You have the break off from Bactria, who became their own little interesting niche known as the Greco-Bactrians, and then later on the Indo-Greeks. And then you have parts in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, who kind of were forming these independent dynasts. So the entire story of the Seleucids is almost this attempt to maintain the status quo. Most of the time it was rather successful, other times not so much. And when, after the defeat of Antiochus in approximately the mid 180s BC by the Roman Republic, the empire kind of maintained a static point within Syria, which we'll discuss in a little bit inevitably, because Syria is a major part about all of this. In terms of impacts, like I said, the Book of Maccabees is a huge one that's influential in terms of the foundation of the Jewish state, in terms of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Not the medieval Jerusalem, but certainly the times of like John Hyrcanus, and then later Herod would be the inheritor of these kingdoms. And essentially, this kind of formed a bedrock where the Seleucids kind of transformed certain areas of the empire that they had formerly ruled over. And they became extremely prosperous in some regions, and then other regions kind of fell apart, but they formed the template model for later empires, like the Parthians, for instance, and then the Romans, who moved into the Seleucids' western territories. And essentially, they're this really fascinating but hardly documented group, because there's almost no real strict source work that we can find on them that we have for those like Rome or in central Greece, or even the Hellenistic period has its own problems in terms of source work. But the Seleucids I find are kind of the least documented of all of them, and I think that's kind of a shame, and I hope to kind of elucidate more a bit about it.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, because when you're talking about the different empires after Alexander the Great, I think most people know about the Ptolemies the most, and obviously they have plenty of star characters there that kind of have that star quality that draw in the crowd, so to speak. And the Seleucids, there's even though they're so large and diverse and so fascinating, they're just less talked about. And I mean, is that just because there's less information about them?
I think that's probably the main contributing factor. I mean, there's in terms of source work, we have brief bits from authors like Appian, who dedicates an entire book of his Roman history to discussing the Seleucids, although it's a very brief and like kind of general, it's just a cursory glance at Seleucid history. There's also the history. There's also Babylonian and Aramaic documents recovered, like such as the Babylonian Chronicles, which are written in cuneiform Akkadian, that kind of give us brief indications of what Seleucid rule was like in Babylonia, and it was written at the time. So that's like the only contemporaneous evidence we have of Seleucid rule. There is also, more famously, we have the preservation of Seleucid history from the authors of the Jewish tradition. So the main ones are Josephus, the Roman historian, the Jewish Romano historian of the 1st century AD under the Flavian emperors. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he discusses the Seleucid rule to some extent, often referring to them as the kings of the north. He dedicates also to discussion about the Maccabean revolt. And generally, with the Seleucid or the Jewish perspective, the Seleucids, it's a bit more hostile. Especially this can be seen with the Book of Maccabees. Now, from memory fails me of which Maccabees book it is that's particularly hostile. I believe Book 2 of Maccabees is the author, because they're written at different time periods, and the authors are clearly slanted in different directions, but they are incredibly hostile, where they refer to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means godlike, as Antiochus IV Epimanes, the mad. They view the Seleucids as almost like this oppressor who's trying to root out Judaism by forcing Hellenization and conversion. And there is some degree of truth to that, but it's a bit more complicated. And the Maccabean revolt is kind of this little nebulous of, it's rooted in that Jewish religious history that's so powerful in the modern, in terms of religious landscapes of today. Whereas there's probably a bit more nuance to it, but still, that if that's one of our major sources, is a very hostile one like them. Polybius of Megalopolis, a Greek historian of the 2nd century BC, is considered often the best historian of the Hellenistic period, if not among the best historians in ancient world.
Yeah.
He talks about a little bit. Unfortunately, we have very few bits from Polybius. We have tantalizing bits, though. He talks about the reign of Antiochus III, who is often considered the greatest of the Seleucid kings after Seleucus I himself. And we are missing pieces where Antiochus makes his journey into Central Asia and India and beyond. But we do have his wars against Ptolemy IV and and Ptolemy's forces in Egypt. And then you have eventually his ultimate defeat by Rome before he dies unceremoniously in his temple sack. So again, we just don't have the source work that we like to. And then even then, most of the sources kind of portray the Seleucids as almost this sort of other, or they're downright hostile. So it does take a lot of work to try to even piece together a chronology of Seleucid sources, never mind actually getting like characterization of its main kings, of figuring out who did what. And we do have to rely on a lot of like contemporary evidence from Babylonia, for instance. And it's a challenge, to be sure, compared to like the Ptolemies and the Antagonids, and especially in Rome in this circumstance.
Yeah, it's really funny because usually you say, history is written by the victors, but it sounds like in this case, history was written by the oppressed. And so that it must be kind of a rare incidence where you have the people underneath the empire who recorded it rather than those in power.
Yeah, I mean, Polybius, that's an excellent point. I kind of bring that up with Polybius, for instance, who was, to put it in context, Polybius was a member of a Greek league that kind of clashed with Rome, and eventually they were defeated, and then Polybius was taken as a political prisoner of the Roman Republic. And so there are questions as to whether or not Polybius may have fluffed up the Romans in comparison to the Seleucids, because the Romans were now his benefactors. With those like the Maccabee authors, clearly they're writing this in post after the events, and depicting it as either hardcore like pro Jewish beliefs, as you're triumphing over the foreign oppressors of the Greeks who are trying to force us to convert to paganism. It's trying to find that balancing act between how much can we take as at face value, how much do we have to interpret, and that is kind of true with all ancient sources, which I think is what makes it so fascinating. But I think that with Seleucids in particular, I mean, the Ptolemies have their own issues, in terms of their perception by ancient authors as slovenly, debaucherous, and just general corrupt. The Seleucid Seleucid kings kind of come out a little bit better in terms of the characterization, but we still have to deal with that lack of sources. And what we have is just so poor in general that it just takes a lot of effort and by scholars to try to reconstruct anything.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting because you have such a diverse empire that the relationship between the kings and queens and their people must be very different depending on the region, because obviously they would have different interactions with the Jews versus the Bactriad Greeks or whatnot. That isn't a consistent relationship, whether they're good or bad.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about the question with Hellenization and the Hellenistic period is, how much can we describe these essentially largely Greek overlords over an indigenous population that greatly outnumber them? And there are often, comparisons between that and colonial empires of the last few centuries, often unfavorably so.
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit more nuanced, where it isn't. I won't think that it's essentially just Greek kings spreading Greek culture and uplifting the land, but it's also not them just uh, partially or adopting these traits of these of these peoples to kind of just placate them. The Seleucids in general, they actually had quite a few. They have quite a few instances that we can suggest, or suggestions that they actually were well approaching the peoples that they ruled over. Now, let me kind of get backtrack a bit. So, when the ruling is an empire as huge as it was, they had to contend with a lot of different precedents and different cultures. Like I said, Babylonians, Iranians, like the Persians, steppe peoples, and they had to kind of come to terms with those people while also trying to maintain their power base, which is largely based on Greco-Macedonians and proponents of Greek culture. Seleucid kings, for instance, kind of styling themselves, they were able to adopt the roles and functions of essentially like Near Eastern rulers. They would do practices that would be befitting of Neo-Babylonian kings and Assyrian kings. One of the Seleucids adopted as their patron deity Apollo. Now, Apollo oftentimes is portrayed as kind of a seated archer, and those who are familiar with Greek mythology kind of get that understanding. However, there's actually an excellent article about this from Kyle L. Erickson, talking about the connections between Apollo and Iranian gods and the iconography of such, where it could be portrayed as a Iranian form of kingship imagery, where the kings are always portrayed as like archers and they're always astride, and then there's also connection between Apollo and native Iranian gods like Nabu. And there is, it's not outlandish considering that, for instance, the second Seleucid king, Antiochus I, his father Seleucus was married to an Iranian princess. Was the only actually the only Macedonian under Alexander who a lot of them were married to Iranian wives, and then Seleucus was the only one who kept his wife Apama or Apame, depending on your pronunciation. And it's very likely that he learned some form of Iranian and kind of was appealing to those Iranian peoples across Central Asia. And then when you kind of compare those two, there's a lot of these roles where they just adopt these religious customs, and later on in Seleucid rule, as they kind of were settled into Syria, they started appealing to the Syriac populations by putting local gods like your Canaanite gods. I'm trying to think of the exact name of them, but they have this flexibility where they are more than willing to kind of present themselves and play the part that, like I said, the Babylonian Chronicles describe them as such. However, they were first and foremost, in my opinion, Greco-Macedonian kings in the style of Alexander. They ruled from horseback. An empire was from horseback, which is not uncommon for ancient societies, but they were all Greek speakers. Their administrative class spoke Greek. They promoted Greek cities or Greek styled cities. They always were described in sources as Macedonian kings, and we're not going to get into this whole discussion between our Macedonians Greeks. That's like a whole other. That's just I'm going to dodge that question here. We'll say that yes, they are Greek. Okay, how about that? But they were perceived by other sources as being Greek, and even by their own subjects who viewed them as Greeks in general. So you have this interesting dynamic where they are more than willing to adopt and to take on these roles. And it probably was, to a certain extent, totally enthusiastic about it, and wasn't just like a face value, a facade, just to kind of keep control of the plebs. They probably did throw themselves into those roles, and it kind of shows how flexible they were. I mean, they maintained a huge empire for almost 300 years, which is pretty impressive considering the scale and diversity and the general kind of a lack of a local power base that they had. But in my opinion, they were unquestionably Greco-Macedonian origin, but still capable of this flexibility.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I would say that the Ptolemies did that as well, right? I mean, like not all of them, but I know that Cleopatra learned Egyptian and was also replicated local Egyptian gods in her like iconography and things like that. So I wonder if it was kind of a more universal tactic among that time period, or is that sort of more uniquely to the Seleucids and the Ptolemies to sort of integrate the local cultures into their rule?
I think it's kind of inevitable with any sort of, the nature of the empires themselves were derived, from military conquest. But when you have a disproportionately small ruling class, largely of Greeks and Greco-Macedonians and whatever combination of in between, where you have, indigenous Egyptians, for instance, in the Ptolemies case. You have to come to terms with some extent to even try to, maintain your maintain your control. Now, of course, you always backed it up with the threat of the spear, but it's still, you couldn't just have it where, you're just enforcing a Greek perspective on the landscape. There had to be some give and take, and especially since Hellenistic kingship was largely transactional in the sense that they weren't, despots and god kings that they ruled without question. They had to kind of contend with the local power bases that oftentimes were these native inhabitants, where you had Iranian overlords in parts of Central Asia. You had the Egyptian priestly class in the case of the Ptolemies. There had to be some sort of mutual understanding between the two, which kind of allowed these Greek rulers to kind of maintain their control. And, you always have to, there's always the question, were they genuine in this adoption of these cultures? And I think to some extent they were. And I think that that's part of it. But I think there's also a sort of a pragmatism in towards it. They had to do this. Otherwise, they probably would not have succeeded as long as they did.
Yeah, I mean, the Romans obviously did that as well. And I mean, hey, I'm a perennial expat. So I know that just naturally, when you're living in various countries, you just kind of automatically find yourself mimicking or integrating. And to find people who never interact with the local culture, it's like almost impossible, even just even as an individual scale in a modern situation. Our human nature, I think, is such that we do want to be a part of the community that we're in, even if it is very different from where we originally came from.
I mean, it was the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But I guess in this case, when in Babylon, do the Babylonians. And having many faces is a key component to maintaining such a large and diverse empire as the Seleucids.
So when we're trying to understand the Seleucid kings, do you think it's best to see them through that Macedonian Greek or the Near Eastern or the Iranian lens? Like, how are we to best understand this empire?
I think that you need to see them through all lenses. I mean, it's also a kind of a consequence of the nature of our source work, where there's one of the books that I highly recommend for people is From Samarkand to Sardis by Susan Sherwin White and Emilie Kurtz, where they talk about how you have to almost view the Seleucids provincially, where you can't just view them as kind of this universal perspective. Like, you have to go from the end, like, to see how they treated each region of their empire differently. The Babylonians weren't always, the Mesopotamia was not treated the same as it was in North Syria, which was not treated the same as in Asia Minor. And you have to kind of understand how they approach these locations and cultures and what they were able to do with it. And Babylon, where you have this entrenched, perspective on how kingship and monarchies and religious practices, you can't just take over and not try to cope with that, not cope necessarily, but try to find some middle ground where you have the Seleucid rules trying to perform the functions of this. Whereas in North Syria, they are very much, it's a Seleucid dynastic stamp. It's almost entirely based around the Seleucid ideology. And there's almost no sort of precedence that the Seleucids need to base their rule upon, which is probably why they originally, their imperial capital was in Babylonia, but that was moved to North Syria eventually, given that, like, they were just able to make it their own personal kingdom, and they were able to rule as such, which I think was what they ultimately wanted. But they still wanted to make sure that their other parts of the empire were happy.
So you mentioned Seleucid ideology. Can you maybe explain what that included? Because that might give us a better idea of who this empire was.
They mitigated power by giving it to local, we'll call them local power holders, to kind of borrow another scholar's term. What that means essentially is that they had to kind of come to terms with local dynasts or warlords, and essentially gave them a certain degree of autonomy and control, which allowed them to kind of have a degree of prestige, such as, minting coins in their own name, kind of styling themselves, at least the imagery of themselves, as monarchs. But in reality, they were serving the Seleucid interests, because the reason why that is because the Seleucids were by and large preoccupied with affairs on their western front. And that would be specifically referring to the Ptolemies, who were kind of their main rival, but also off and on the Antigonids as well in Macedonia. The only way that the Seleucids could mitigate this is by operating with we'll call it a peripatida government. Essentially, the Seleucids were always on campaign, but that doesn't really mean that they were always like on the march for war, even though a ridiculous number of the Seleucid kings, especially the first 14, died in military engagements or while on military campaigns. They were always marching and moving along the empire to city, passing through the countryside. And this kind of did a couple different things. One, it's kind of eased the burden of hosting, I guess, a specific capital and trying to deal with the different threats on the front of the empire. Now, Syria was essentially its main capital, but there was no main capital city, we'll call it. There were multiple capitals depending on the region. Sardis in Asia Minor, for instance. You had a couple of the major cities like Antioch and Seleucia and the Piraea, and then you had Seleucia on the Tigris in Mesopotamia, and so on and so forth. They would move through these regions to kind of make their imperial presence known and felt. They would be dealing with direct delegations from cities and from representatives of cities, because they would be ultimately kind of the locus of power that would move across the empire to try to make sure that their presence was felt. Otherwise, you had instances where satraps would revolt, different native inhabitants would go into rebellion, and it was kind of a juggling act. They had to really figure out a way to constantly be on the move while also dealing with threats on their fronts. And now, the most of the time, they were moving up and down the Levantine coast and into Asia Minor. And it's very rare that they actually entered into their eastern satrapies, which would be, Bactria and parts of that area. But that's possibly led to the reason why the Seleucid Empire kind of fell off in the eastern provinces. They were actually pretty successful at this. It was almost ceremonial in aspect. We have a recording from Josephus that kind of indicates how when they entered the city, it would be this very elaborate affair where the act of opening the gates in the first place was a sign of submission, but the priests of Jerusalem would come out and chant with torches as the kings would march into the city. They would play host, but then, given the enormous size of the Seleucid army and the cost of feeding this host, they would move on at their own terms. So this allowed these regions to kind of get a breather and not be overburdened by the Seleucid presence. And that's probably the most unique aspect, or one of the most unique aspects when compared to their other Hellenistic monarchs, where the Ptolemies were pretty consistently based in Alexandria off the Nile Delta. The Antagonids did not have as large of control. They were just based largely in Macedonia, and they had their own capital cities. But the Seleucids, to kind of compensate for that huge administrative and logistical nightmare that was their empire, they really had to find a way to deal with it. And this constant movement was just one of those ways.
Wow, it's amazing to imagine like the army coming in. They must have been terrified when this just rolling giant army came to town. That'd be probably a good way of keeping them in check, just reminding them, hey, this is what we've got coming for you if you try to rebel. I was wondering though, with this sort of huge patchwork of different peoples and cultures underneath this one empire, was there internal fighting between the different groups, or because they had kind of an oppressor, and I'm using bunny ears when saying that they were united against a common enemy, or was there always kind of bubblings between neighbors?
That's a good question. In terms of any standout examples, there was not really, I guess, a concentrated effort from different parts of the empire to rebel against the Seleucids altogether. It would be individual regions, oftentimes, propped up by a particular lord or a power base who wanted to kind of assert control for themselves. In general, though, there are instances of actually a lot of the native inhabitants actually working with the Seleucids, where, starting out with Seleucus the First, looking at the sources, it looks like he was actually, at least when compared to other of the Greco-Macedonian governors or satraps under Alexander's time, Seleucus seems to be relatively well liked by the Babylonian populace, and actually, probably the vast majority of Seleucus's forces were Iranian in origin, rather than Greco-Macedonian. So there must have been this at least degree of cooperation and mutual understanding between the two groups, where they found that Seleucus, when compared to, say like Antigonus Monophthalmos, who almost razed Babylon to the ground, he found the Seleucids to be particularly, not necessarily kind, but certainly tolerable, rather than finding some sort of nationalistic fervor. You do have rebellions popping up here and there, but that's kind of the extent with any sort of empire, especially during transitory periods such as kings dying, where you have power claimants or people trying to stake out their own. And the Seleucids were pretty flexible at giving a degree of autonomy to their subjects when compared to somebody that's more bureaucratic like the Ptolemies. But they seem to be relatively peaceful, or best relatively stable. The vast majority of the Seleucids problems comes from civil wars. Let's just put that mildly.
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine that there's the people would be just sort of used to having various kings in charge, and I wonder. And I've discussed this before too, with regards to Alexander the Great's empire. Is if you have such a large empire and a time and place in which you're not, like you said, the fastest way you can travel is by horseback. How much impact really does the individual kings have in this sort of vast territory? I mean, maybe they come to town and everybody like sharpens up, but for the vast majority of the time, people probably live their lives kind of as they used to.
Yeah, it's interesting when I try to always see the common person's perspective in the wake of like the narrative of like great battles and kings, and you always have to try to take their perspective as like, oftentimes you find where it's just like, whoever, I'm paying taxes to somebody, whether it's this Greek king or it's somebody else. And that's oftentimes what you find the majority of the situation with peasants. They're kind of like, they just want to live their lives in relative peace and quiet, and whoever is maintaining that is fine by them. There are instances where, especially with the Ptolemies, where they had a 30-year-long rebellion by native Egyptian subjects, that there are indications that this wasn't the case. However, there actually is quite a bit of interesting information, because we do have quite a few bits and pieces of what the average person thought necessarily. So whether they were, for example, we have records from Babylonian text or cuneiform text from Babylonia that kind of piece together what life was like. The initial period of Seleucus's rule and during the wars of the successors of Alexander was quite destructive. The Babylonian Chronicles kind of just talk about how the price of wheat was skyrocketed and people were starving. And there was, I think the exact lines were, quote, "and there was weeping and mourning through the land," which is pretty visceral, and how it describes the average. You can only imagine what the average common person was. But you do have kind of bits and pieces here where, for example, because Alexander and his successors kind of populated these regions with Greco-Macedonian settlers to kind of form the military class of sorts, you do find instances of Greeks living among Babylonians. For instance, you have, for example, I'm guessing we'll talk about this later, is like, for example, the Seleucid city of Seleucia on the Tigris, which is a little bit north of Babylonia, kind of became the new center of power for Mesopotamia for centuries. But Babylonia, you had Seleucia rather, was very much a Greek city, although there are definite Babylonian elements where you have populations that they clearly indulge in Babylonian art styles and religions. But they are predominantly Greek. But then you also have Greeks living in ancient cities like Uruk, where you have these Macedonian settlers that are living among as shepherds or living in the population, probably intermarrying with the local population to some extent. There were not that many Greek women that went along with Alexander's campaign, so you had to kind of find your own wives in these regions, which was almost inevitable. But you do have this general perception of just life kind of goes on. And I think that's kind of true with a lot of different empires, barring the initial conquests where there's mass suffering and despotism, or not despotism, but just suffering inflicted due to the nature of warfare. You just don't find, and we just don't have as much in terms of daily life as we'd like to, but it seems to be relatively quiet. We just have the perspective of the upper echelon in this case, which is a little bit unfortunate, but you got to have to take what you can get.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the reality with most of ancient history, that that the agrarian history is just a little less overlooked. And it's kind of interesting that now they're sort of delving into that a bit more than they used to.
Yeah, I think especially with the agrarian population, it's almost like, I mean, actually, with one of the big discussions of the Hellenistic period is, or was one of the talked about angles is the idea of urbanization, where with Hellenistic rulers, like kind of one of the big things, Alexander the Great is famous for naming multiple cities after himself. I think the number of like 70 that Plutarch gives is a little high, and it's a little bit generous to think of them as entirely like full grown cities. But the Seleucids in particular were a society that heavily sponsored, not necessarily urbanization, but definitely city founding. Um, the first major region of this was in Mesopotamia. Like I mentioned, Seleucus the First had, kind of resided in Babylon as his first administrative capital, but he had built the city of Seleucia on the Tigris north of them. Now, most of the major cities were on the Euphrates prior to this, in Babylonian terms, but Seleucus had reoriented the political landscape from the Euphrates up to the Tigris. And Seleucia was enormous by any comparison. We don't have much of the evidence. We do know of the plan of the general layout of the city. It was extremely large. I think at one point, Pliny the Elder says that it had up to 500,000 people, which at least,
Wow.
and that's rivaling, Rome at its time, and also the city of Alexandria, which is in Egypt, which is often seen as the greatest Hellenistic city of the time. And in actually kind of give it a perspective on this, then their reorientation of the Seleucia on the Tigris kind of formed the template for the later empires that would be established in Iraq, where the Parthians, who kind of were the eastern successors of the Seleucids, founded their city of Ctesiphon right next to Seleucia on the Tigris, almost as a twin city. And Seleucia continued to be served as an administrative capital, where Pliny describes in the second century, almost first century AD, where they were still retaining their Greek and Macedonian customs centuries after Seleucid rule had faltered. And then later on, even later than the Parthians, would be the Abbasid Caliphate in the mid to late 800s, where they would establish Baghdad, one of the greatest cities in world history, adjacent to Seleucia on the Tigris. But the other major region of Seleucid settlement and urbanization would take place in North Syria. Now, prior to Seleucid rule, the region was largely it was inhabited, but there was no real urban landscape to call that. The Persians only had maybe a few settlements there, here and there, and there were local Syriac populations. But one of the Alexander's successors, Antigonus Monophthalmos, or Antigonus the One-Eyed, who was the founder member of the Antigonid dynasty that later ruled in Macedonia, for a time kind of controlled North Syria and began to plant cities bearing his name. However, when Seleucus won control of Syria following the Battle of Ipsus in 301, they began to transform North Syria into the urban and imperial, like a centerpiece of the empire. Syria became heavily urbanized and densely populated, and from approximately the end of the 4th century to the beginning of the 2nd century, the population went from maybe 500,000 to well over 2.5 million. The major cities that formed they're often described as the Tetrapolis. You have your famous ones like Antioch, or Antioch on the Orontes, but known as the Antioch. You have Seleucia and Piraea. You have there's Antioch, not Antioch by Daphne. That's also another name for Antioch. Antioch on the Orontes, but there were several cities that kind of formed as this major urban locus of the empire, and they all bore dynastic names. And one of the interesting things about it is that they also were the only places in the entire empire that bore settlements with Greek and Macedonian names. Now, what I mean by that is that you would often find there, for example, a settlement called Larissa, which is also named after the city in Thessalian Larissa in Greece. This is the only region in the entire empire that is like this, and it is very likely that this was a conscious effort on part of the Seleucids to kind of reconstruct a new Macedonian homeland for themselves since they were no longer in Macedonia. They had to kind of construct a new dynastic homeland to call their own. And we can't really just call it like a transplanted Macedonia. In effect, it was Macedonia. There was the Orontes River was named also after the river that runs by Pella once in a while. The Seleucia and Piraea formed the the mausoleum for the Seleucid dynasty, which kind of acted as like the ceremonial marker for this is the Seleucids' new homeland. They're being buried here. And the region was so prosperous that it continued to be so under Roman rule, and really only faltered about 1,000 years after Seleucus the first settled after Seleucus the first had first settled his armies, or his populations and cities there. When you have the late Middle Ages, where after Antioch is lost by Rome to Persia, and then eventually is lost by Rome to the Umayyad Caliphate, and it really only faltered until the High Middle Ages. So that's pretty impressive in terms of the Seleucids. It's a testament to how much dedication and how well planned these regions were, and how they were able to transform the landscape that was relatively uninhabited to almost a Greek Macedonian transplant, but we're still retaining this imperial and highly urbanized and planned settlement region. And there are, you can't break a few eggs without making some, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And there was probably some considerable strife that this caused, but for the most part, it was an incredible feat in terms of urbanization and planning, and quite one of the major political and economic legacies of the Seleucids.
So it's almost like a Magna Graecia over again, but a couple hundred years later, much later. So would you say, what is the sort of like the lasting impact then of the Seleucids? Would you be able to sort of see their impact in these regions today? I mean, through this urbanization, or is there more elements that is sort of a lasting artifacts of that time period?
Sadly, with most Seleucid cities, barring a few exceptions like Antioch, we just don't have as much physical evidence of them as we'd like. However, there are a few kind of main contributing legacies towards the region. Like I just mentioned, the urbanization of North Syria kind of made it a imperial hub for over 1,000 years, well after the Seleucids had passed on. And the Romans would kind of, especially in the Seleucids western territories, the Seleucids would kind of move in, and I'm sorry, the Seleucids western territories, the Romans would move in and kind of just insert themselves into the administrative seats that the empire had kind of already established. And Antioch became like the third major city of the empire after Rome, and then maybe Alexandria. It may have been second or third, depending on the time. And that was one of the major things I kind of point out to with a lot of Hellenistic monarchies, is that without their work in the in the Levant and Egypt and Asia Minor, the Romans would not have had nearly as much success as they did. And it kind of shows, because the locus of power for the Roman Empire moved to these heavily Hellenized provinces, and that's where they continue to remain all the way down to 1453, and following the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire. And that is in part the Seleucid efforts at kind of reconstructing the landscape to fit their needs. And that is a major legacy behind them. Another one, kind of an interesting one I find, is what is known as the Seleucid era. Now, prior to the time of Seleucus, there was, and even contemporary to them, there was not really a kind of we'll call it almost a progressive system of time measurement or chronology. I mean, you did have a few instances here and there where you had the Olympiads, which is based on, like, every 4 years the Olympic Games would go on. So at a certain point, you reach the 170th Olympiad, which would be from approximately the mid 8th century down to whatever time that would be. And for example, in Greece and Rome, they would have the annual, like, they would describe events as in the year of the consul, which is the kind of the Roman magistrate, or the year of the archon in Athens, which are yearly limits to power and yearly offices. So it kind of formed as a convenience chronological system. And in the Near East, though, you always had things described in terms of regnal years. So in the third year of Ashurbanipal, or they would describe momentous events such as, in the year of the dragon boat is one of the kind of one that stand out to me. But when the Seleucids kind of came in, one of the major changes they made was the introduction of the Seleucid era. Now, essentially, what they did was they created a fixed point in the year 312, 311. It depends on, because it depends on the use of the Babylonian or the Macedonian calendar, which had different new years beginning and ending. But in the Babylonian case, it began in 312 in April. And the Seleucid rule essentially made 312, 311 as year zero. Now, it basically start off as year zero, and then each progressive year. So it'll be in the first year of this, in year one, year two, and so on and so forth. So 310 be year one, 309 would be year three, and so on and so forth. But what they did, though, is now create a system that was constantly progressing, regardless of the ruler who was in charge, regardless of how many years that king has reigned. There would always be kind of like a fixed static date. So, for instance, 100 years down the line, it would be year 100, and then 200 years, and so on and so forth. This continued to be widely used throughout Central Asia and through the Near East. And in effect, on one hand, one of the reasons why it ties into it is because the year zero kind of falls on the Babylonian New Year, which kind of acts as this like when, to put in more context, so when Seleucus was kicked out of Babylon by the Antigonids, he returned, or at least timed himself as beginning in year 312 as his regnal or his regnal date, where he assumed the title of king, when in reality he took it in 306 along with the other monarchs. But 312 acted as this great kind of like nebulous it lined up with Babylonian New Year, it lined up with his return to Babylon, and so it made him more legitimate in the eyes of his Babylonian subjects. But the idea of a Seleucid dating system like that kind of gives a sense of consistency and a sense of stability, whereas you regardless whoever's in charge, it's always the same Seleucid era. And that is like also another form of dynastic propaganda. You're naming your dates after the years of Seleucid rule. And cities would, and once this was introduced, many cities kind of adopted their own variations. The Parthians would adopt the Parthian era once they began taking over. Certain other cities, like the city of Ardados, would kind of reject the Seleucid era, but then they would start their own version of it from year zero, and same thing with Pergamon. But perhaps what people might not know is that this would actually lead to the creation of several modern calendrical system or dating systems. For example, the Christian Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and the progressive forward for that. The Islamic Hijra, so starting from I don't know the exact specifics. I believe it's from Muhammad receiving his visions. Then that's kind of what led to the creation of those particular systems. And honestly, actually, the Seleucid era system was used as far as the Middle Ages. We still find Syriac gravestones in as far as Western China, in approximately the region of Kazakhstan, where you have the Syriac religious these not Manichaeans, excuse me. You have Christians in Kazakhstan and China from in the Middle Ages that still are using the Seleucid era thousands of years after the last Seleucid king ruled in Syria. So I think that's an incredible concept, and it seems so mundane, but it's such a fascinating way in how they perceive themselves in their empire. And again, if you're interested in the subject at all, I do recommend Time and Its Adversaries in the Seleucid Empire by Paul Cosman, if you want to really go into the whole system. But I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this empire, and I think that's what kind of elevates them in some perspective as to why I find them so interesting, because it's such a unorthodox way of approaching rule.
I think maybe we're due for a new calendar. I mean, if every different empires gets to rename them and stuff like that, maybe we should start renaming the calendar months and making them a bit more contemporary.
Well, I mean, as soon as aliens land and we make first contact, I think that's going to be the closest thing to it. But who knows if that's going to ever happen at this rate?
Yeah. Okay, so to shift the focus a little bit to yourself, you've been doing a lot of work on the Hellenistic Age. And in fact, you have a podcast named the Hellenistic Age Podcast. Can you maybe tell us why you specifically decided to delve into the Hellenistic era rather than any other time period in history?
Well, I've always found myself attracted to the ancient world in particular, in comparison to, say, the medieval period, although I've kind of expanded my horizons into late antiquity. But, even as a kid, I always found ancient Rome fascinating, ancient Greece. But then, I listen to podcasts like I kind of make this as a joke that almost every podcaster is, talks about Mike Duncan to some extent, or specifically ancient historian podcasters talk about Mike Duncan's History of Rome was kind of a major inspiration in that regards. But when I was trying to come up with an idea, it was almost spontaneous in how I thought, well, maybe I could try podcasting about a history subject. What would I talk about? And really, at the time, Alexander the Great was the only one I could think of that was not really talked about, but still I could talk a lot about. But then I thought, well, that I can only do so many episodes on that, and that could really form as a nice template to like practice and learn. What if I just do the entire Hellenistic period? Because the Hellenistic period, which I guess for people who aren't exactly too familiar, that's approximately from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC until the death of Cleopatra and the conquest of Egypt by the Roman Republic and Octavian Augustus Caesar in 30 BC. And there are, technicalities regarding, is that actually a date we should settle on? But I like it as a nice bookmark period. Now, my choice in the Hellenistic period is a bit unusual because I've always been mainly an ancient Rome person. The Hellenistic powers were always this like kind of peripheral entity when compared to Rome, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like a Greek ruler in Egypt, or I barely knew of the Seleucids, even less. And I thought this might be a good opportunity for me to learn. And that I didn't really, at the time, there was not many podcasts talking about the Hellenistic period, besides like kind of the bookends where you talk about either the wars of the successors or you talk about Cleopatra, and that's kind of it. Everything in between seemed so interesting and so like unexplored that I thought this might be a great way to for me to learn, and also for me to help others learn who don't know where to begin. And so I kind of like to style my show as, as a great launching platform for other people to find more works about relatively untapped subjects. And originally my intent was just to kind of cover the main three, or the big three, I call them, the Seleucids, the Antigonids, and the Ptolemies. But as I've gone on, I've sort of expanded my scope to kind of covering almost every culture in between the shores of Spain and India, in between 323 and 30 BC. So it's the task I've created for myself has just grown, has exponentially increased what I was expecting. But I think that the Hellenistic period has a lot of people that are interested, and I think that's something that I'm really happy to see, where I get a lot of comments saying, I've been trying to look for stuff on this material, I didn't know where to go, but thank you so much. And I think I appreciate those comments the most, because I barely knew anything about them, and I feel that being able to give people the opportunity to learn about them as well, especially given how interesting the period is, I believe, it's really satisfying to see that kind of the response. And I'm happy that people are taking a little interest in my rinky-dink show.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with me today and teaching everybody a bit more about this really, really fascinating time period. You're totally right that it's so much more interesting than the kind of attention that it's given. And I think it's important just to learn more and more about all these different time periods, and to see the extent of ancient history that we can find out is just absolutely fascinating. So I encourage everybody to check out Hellenistic Age Podcast. I think it's a really fantastic show, and I think you do a great job illuminating another corner of history.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to the show. And I hope everybody can kind of happy to join us. And we're still about a third of the way through. So we still have quite a journey to go to. So I hope you join us soon.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. You can learn more about the Hellenistic Age with Derek's podcast at HellenisticAgePodcast.wordpress.com, or follow him on Twitter at twitter.com/HellenisticPod. Also, please remember to get your tickets for this year's symposium. Watch live our fantastic lineup of professors, authors, and philosophers, and join in the conversation. We'll be hosting Victor Davis Hanson, Angie Hobbs, Michael Fontaine, A.A. Long, and Stephen Dando Collins, just to name a few more. Go to classicalwisdom.com/symposium for more information on how to get your tickets.